This podcast episode of RealAg Radio is brought to you by Authority Strike Herbicide from FMC. With just one application, Authority Strike gives you a strong start with a powerful one-pass burn-off and keeps working later with extended weed control. Stop by your local retailer or visit ag.fmc.com/ca to learn more.
It's time for RealAg Radio on Rural Radio Channel 147 on Sirius XM. RealAg Radio and RealAgriculture.com is your home for insight and analysis of the issues that are impacting your farm business. Let's get real and get connected with RealAg Radio.
Yes. Okay. Excellent. Welcome to RealAg Radio here on Rural Radio Channel 147, Sirius XM. I am your host, Lyndsey Smith, and a very special day. I've got a co-host, Kelvin Heppner. Welcome here.
Yes, good to be here, and also special because we're broadcasting today from the Canadian Federation of Agriculture's annual general meeting, so it's an honor to be here at the conference in Ottawa, and looking forward to the show.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so super fun to be able to do this in front of a live audience. So just to let everybody know, listening at home, that we do have a live audience, give us a clap, please. There we go. All right. Thank you all very much. Okay, so we are at the CFA AGM. Today's topic is a big one, and we've got a fantastic lineup for you. You're going to hear from Dan Watchorn, Tom Rosser, Matt Dykshoorn, and Kevin Boon. And so we are going to travel from the insurance world to the government world and, of course, into the farmer world to get a perspective on disaster occurrences, disaster relief, and where we're sort of at in where we are with programs and the farmer experience as well.
Yeah, I think there are plenty of reasons to talk about this, why this is an important conversation, and you just have to look at the last couple of years, examples of disasters across the country. You start on the West Coast, atmospheric rivers, flooding, heat domes, wildfires. BC seems to have a lot of these, which is, I guess, why we have some BC representation on stage coming up here on the show. And as you move east, you get into the prairies. Of course, drought has been a major issue. Hail is an issue in areas every year. Ontario, they had, I think you had 2 weeks without a nice gentle rain at one point
so
last June.
That was very troubling.
That was a disaster,
yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We can't help it, Kelvin. We're kind of
I'm the Westerner here, so I'm bringing
exactly.
some Western perspective to balance things out.
Yeah.
But yeah, as you cross the country, Ontario, of course, the snow event last week or the week before in terms of some disaster situations unfolding on farms there as well. In Quebec, the Maritimes, you get into the tropical storms. And so certainly relevant. And as I farm as well, and when you look at that insurance line on the budget, it's been growing every year the last while by a significant amount. And so in some cases, potentially double what it was a decade ago. And I think certainly something that farmers are noticing and why it's important to have this conversation today, how we can work to mitigate risk and cover those, share the burden of that risk between the individual business owner, that is the farmer, the producer, the rancher, and the private insurer and government. We have Tom Rosser, Deputy Assistant Deputy Ag Minister, joining us a bit later, and he'll share some of the government perspective on how we can maybe better approach and share this risk to mitigate it to the industry and to our country's economy.
And we are going to talk quite a bit about natural disasters, of course, but then we also have potential disease outbreaks or different things like that also happen. And so we'll touch on as many as we can, but it's definitely something of increasing risk to many farms, and looking forward to, of course, the Cooperators joining us here in the next segment to talk about just the scale and scope of trying to ensure some of these losses, etc. So without further ado, we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back with Dan Watchorn, Vice President, Commercial and Farm Insurance with Cooperators, who, of course, are sponsoring today's show as well. So we'll be right back with more RealAg Radio.
It's now time for a product spotlight, joined by the senior agronomist with Koch Agronomic Services, Bryce Geisel. Bryce, a lot of growers, they're concerned about where the profit margins are. How can we maximize the ROI of the nitrogen investment they're making on their farms?
A big return on that investment is to keep more of that nitrogen applied in the field being available for your crops. So unless you're putting that nitrogen 3 inches down where it will be well protected, nitrogen stabilizer might be a fit to help reduce those nitrogen losses, kind of that leaching, denitrification, volatilization losses. I think one of the big things too is making sure that you're using the right kind of stabilizer for your application. There's going to be needs that you should be just utilizing a urease inhibitor like Anvil, other applications where you're using just a nitrification inhibitor like Centuro, and there's going to be other times where you're going to need both those types of inhibitors because you're trying to protect from all 3 forms of losses. So a product like Super U or Tribune are going to be great additions to be able to use those. So there's a lot to go through, but you can definitely go to our website, kochagronomicservices.ca, and you can get all that information.
I'm Lyndsey Smith from RealAgriculture.com. Join me Monday nights for The Agronomist, a 1-hour live and interactive show broadcast across YouTube, Facebook, and X. Monday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern, I host expert agronomists from all over the country to give you answers to some of the toughest agronomic questions. Join us live or catch the replay Tuesday morning. That's The Agronomist with me, Lyndsey Smith, Monday nights live at 8 p.m. Eastern.
Welcome back to RealAg Radio here on Rural Radio, Channel 147, Sirius XM. I am your co-host, Lyndsey Smith. Joining me, of course, Kelvin Heppner. And we bring in Dan Watchorn with Cooperators. Dan, welcome here.
Thank you very much, Lyndsey and Kelvin. Appreciate being here. It's great to be part of this conversation. Great to be sponsoring this event. And just a little plug for the Cooperators. This is our 80th anniversary. We were formed by farmers in Saskatchewan, and we've grown to be one of the largest farm insurers in Canada. So we're excited to be here. We're committed to farmers. We're committed to the farming industry, and we want to help really solve the problems that farmers are dealing with.
So what are some of the trends you're seeing right now? Paint us the scene from the insurer's perspective right now, Deb.
Yeah, this conversation is really important. I mean, we're talking about disaster relief, but disaster relief is a byproduct of a problem, right? And the problem is the severity and frequency of weather-related events, and this isn't a new problem. When we look at it statistically, the increase in weather-related events has been happening for over 20 years, right? And it's like a curve. You can just see the amount of insured losses being paid out due to severe weather-related events. 2024, it was a record year, right? It was a record year for us with 4 major events in less than 4 weeks. We had the southwestern Ontario flood. We had the wildfires in Jasper. We had the remnants of Hurricane Debbie caused flooding in Montreal and parts of Quebec, and then we had the hailstorm. And all total, that was $8.5 billion, and that's a staggering amount. I think the problem is real, and we need to look for different solutions to how we respond to it.
Not only are we seeing these weather events, the value of everything that is insured as well has skyrocketed, and so that, of course, is something that raises the bottom line in terms of that dollar amount as well.
Oh, 100%. And the problem is, I think we've been just looking historically at how we've responded in traditional ways, right? Claims cause premiums to go up, right? And when claims are going up, then we, charge premiums and we segment our business. We need to use the data and the insights that we have from these events to more proactively look at how we, what I would call weatherproof our farms, weatherproof our communities. And that needs to be a collaborative effort between farmers, the farming community, insurers, the private sector, as well as governments. But we need to come together to look at the problem, not just focus on disaster relief, which is a solution, but not the only solution.
Mm-hmm. So when it does come to trying to work through some of these approaches, there's always that discussion of the carrot or the stick, right? And so what does that look like potentially from the insurance side of encouraging potentially change to, have farmers themselves doing some of this mitigation work?
I think it starts with education now. Like as a cooperative insurer, our goal really, our mission is financial security for Canadians and their communities. And obviously the farming sector is a huge community that we support. But we can't just follow traditional ways. So we have a lot of data. We have a lot of data as insurers. And there's associations and organizations out there that focus on this problem, right? We have the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. We've got the Canadian Climate Institute. We've got Cat IQ. There's so much data out there that we can use to better educate farmers, to better educate the communities on what we can do to weatherproof the farms and the farming communities. And we need to work closer with government. And I'm glad Tom's here because I think that's an important part of the conversation.
So when you talk about weatherproofing or minimizing that risk going forward, insurance, from my perspective, has usually dealt with replacement. You replace something to where it was before the disaster happened. What's your perspective on this whole idea of build back better or building back to a place where the risk is less than it was before the disaster happened?
Well, this is where I think the insurance industry needs to step up. In fact, we introduced a new endorsement in our policy back last year. It's called Tomorrow Strong. And it's basically saying that in the event of a weather-related event, where you have to replace or you have to rebuild your structures, that we will invest in more sustainable approaches to how you do that rebuild. We want to be part of the solution. So, it makes no sense to continue to put asphalt roofs in a hail zone, right? Because all we're doing is filling up landfalls, paying out claims at the next event, and increasing premiums as a result of it. It makes no sense to continue to do that. So we have to, as an industry, start to look at how we participate in the resiliency goals and objectives.
Mm-hmm. All right. We are going to hear now in our next segment from some farmers as well, some ranchers, to talk about their experience. But Tom, you'll be joining us for the fourth segment, coming on back to talk about some of those solutions, some of the ways we can work together. So we will be back with more RealAg Radio after this quick break.
Every farmer defines success differently, and every farm has its own unique challenges. Corteva Biologicals is partnering with Canadian farmers for their success, offering unique solutions that improve and protect crops from start to finish, based on each field's needs. Using proven predictable solutions across all crop stages, Corteva Biologicals helps build healthy, productive, and profitable farms. Corteva Biologicals, we're growing together. Get all the information you need to keep your pulse crop healthy and profitable with the Pulse School on RealAgriculture.com. The Pulse School is a free YouTube video series covering agronomy, research, and more across a host of different pulse crops. It's also available as an audio podcast wherever you download or stream your favorite podcast. Check us out on YouTube or visit RealAgriculture.com. The Pulse School, brought to you by BSF Canada.
Every year, humic loss makes it harder for crops to absorb applied nutrients. Resurge from Helena is a low-dust granule that delivers humic compounds to improve nutrient uptake and plant growth. The Resurge granule's superior hardness and uniformity withstands pneumatic applications, allowing for even distribution in your fertilizer and across the acre. Energize your soil and elevate your crops. Contact your Helena representative to learn more. Always follow label instructions and check registration status before use.
Welcome back to RealAg Radio here on Rural Radio, channel 147, Sirius XM. I am your host, Lyndsey Smith, joined by Kelvin Heppner, of course, and we are at the CFA AGM in Ottawa, Ontario. This show brought to you by Cooperators. Joining us now, we have Kevin Boon, General Manager with BC Cattlemen, and we have Matt Dykshoorn, BC Dairy Farmer. Kevin, maybe I'll start with you. Just give us a bit of a rundown of what the experience has been in the last few years from your perspective.
Yeah, thank you, Lyndsey. I guess 2017, I would say that I was a virgin in disaster management, in no expression of the word. We had dealt with small fires and stuff, but in 2017 that exploded, where we saw close to 2 million acres of land burn up, large fires join into mega fires. And we were thrown into a situation then where it was really managing the people on the ground became a much bigger event. Before that, it was quite easy. We didn't see evacuation orders in the size and extremes that we did. So 2017 was the groundbreaker. But since that time, we've had 4 years of major fires, floods, and that have all impacted very heavily the agriculture industry. And I think that there's things that people don't necessarily think about in the fact that when these disasters happen at the scale they do, it is agriculture and it is rural that really get affected the most. And that's where we've had to learn to cope with.
And Matt, what about you?
We were heavily impacted by the flood in 21. Our farm is it's in a low zone. We're aware of that. But we were impacted a lot heavier than we had expected. We'd made plans when we saw the rains coming, but nothing could prepare us for what we did experience.
How long were you in emergency mode, and can you maybe take us through those days and some of the lessons you learned during that time?
It was a Sunday night. We started making preparations. My dad and I worked all night moving hay and straw up to the high barn. We made the decision Monday morning to leave the cattle in the barns because they are built on a ridge. The last barn I built was built a foot higher than the 1990 flood, which you'll never see a 1990 flood again. The water was 3 feet higher than 1990. So, we ended up with cows underwater, or standing in water for 24 hours. The dike across the Sumas Prairie blew, flooded out a lot of other farms, but our water went down. So then we shifted into cleanup mode. So it was a few weeks of cleanup. Then we actually ended up evacuating the herd because there was a real threat of a reoccurrence. And then the next basically 2 years was just getting the farm back up to speed, getting crop rotations in, getting calving cycles back, and all that. So it was a long haul.
So, and that is, I think, in want to hear from both of you, and we are focused, of course, on a livestock component, but there are others as well. But one of the things I think that sometimes we forget about, because it doesn't happen to us, and Kevin, you're not the only one who maybe disasters haven't happened to, that, for livestock especially, there's a long-term recovery from this. Because it's feed that you lose, or it's feed you couldn't make, it's, breedings that didn't happen, or cattle that need to heal before they can. All of those things that work together, or rebuilding flocks, etc. So, Kevin, maybe that's one of the things I want to touch on, and Matt as well, is sort of after the, emergency part, what was harder shortly thereafter to recover from that surprised you?
Yeah, that recovery, it never fully happens. I think that one of the things that we've seen, and, the 2021 that Matt talks about in the atmospheric river, you got to remember that a month prior to that, we'd burnt up half of BC, and in the second largest fire event that we've ever seen in British Columbia, and a lot of the same people that got burnt out in the interior where the flood started. And so they were trying to rebuild from a fire, and the flood hit them. When that flood hit them, some of them lost 30, 40 acres of land that washed away and ended up down in Matt's backyard. You don't recover from that. You can't replace that land. But what you can do is you start and build and rebuild. As Matt said in 91, I think he said you rebuilt a foot higher because the next one wasn't going to come that high. You don't know what's coming, but you start and be resilient to the fact that it could come again. One of the things with the rebuild in fires is so different than floods. Floods, you're always in that low plane. You're probably going to get hit again. A fire, once it's through, you're probably safe for 4 or 5 years if you're lucky. It's not going to come back through again. But you have to prepare for it. And so we end up with a lot of newbies, and every time a disaster hits, they think they're the only ones and it's the first ones. But we're learning from it, and it's how we educate and how we rebuild and how we prepare for the next one as part of it. But insurance and government programs, Agri-Recovery, DFAA, those are integral to the recovery and to, we talked earlier about mental health. If we haven't got that to rebuild, like the impact that Matt and his family and his neighbors would have gone through is one that we sometimes don't think about. You don't pull your bootstraps up. You get in there and you fight, but at the end, 2 years down the road, you're dealing with, post-traumatic stress. And those are things that we don't think as agriculture we should have, but they are. Rebuild, recovery, it's all part of having that assurance that somebody's there to have your back. It's one of the things that an organization, the different agriculture organizations we have, are able to take some of that stress off. We are part of that. And so this is a long story, so I'll keep it short and I'll move on and let Matt tell some stuff. But it's very intertwined and a long process to get there.
Matt, feel free to jump in. Speak to the services programs. Kevin mentioned insurance, agri-recovery, DFA. What was your experience dealing with those programs?
The agri-recovery was integral, for sure. We had a very positive experience with our farm. I know some farms struggled with it more. I don't know the specifics, but it is a lot of paperwork under a time of duress. There's different planning advisors, so that there were some challenges with that. Unfortunately, insurance for us isn't really a thing, being in a floodplain. My dad lost a flock of chickens. That was covered under livestock peril. But as far as the cleanup and repair, no, the insurance doesn't. Our policy, at least, and most, did not provide any assistance.
So what, to Kevin's point about sort of how long the recovery takes and how much work, we're only a few years out from this. What has gone better than you anticipated? What has been harder than you anticipated?
The cropping, well, we ended up reseeding the entire farm. All our perennial grasses, all our cover crops, we basically just started from scratch. And we actually had a really good growing summer. We had timely rains. I have an irrigation system. So we ended up with excess feed at the end of the year. So we were blessed that way. The cattle took about 2 years to really find their groove again. So, but they're doing well. But yeah, it is definitely a journey.
What about on the mental side of things that Kevin's talking about? What has that journey been like?
It's tough, for sure. It's something we've dealt with, we're dealing with. But yeah, it's there has been a lot of support through I think BC Ag Council, BC Ag Safe. So yeah, there are definitely services out there that have been utilized.
Kevin, from BC Cattlemen's perspective, in working with ranchers that have gone through, perhaps more than one wildfire, as you said, you might get a reprieve for a couple of years. What is the impact on, keeping people ranching? Do a lot of people just sell out and quit?
Yeah, and so that support is there. And, we've talked about agri-recovery, and I'll just give you a real quick little story here of the one fire. I had a guy phone me, and he says, I don't know what I'm going to do. I have lost everything. It's where the fire had started. And he says, I'm beside myself. And he said, I don't know where my cows are. I don't know if I have any left. I don't know what it is. And, of course, we're talking about living, breathing animals here, and this weighs heavy. I said, if I can get you up in a helicopter, would that help? And he says, if I could just see what's out there, it would. So next day, he was on a helicopter, gives me a phone call. I can still hear the helicopter behind him. And I says, Jordan, how was it? And he says, well, it's worse than I thought. The day before, he said, I've lost everything. My life is over. It's worse than I thought. But I found some cows. He says, I've got something there to go back to. We got Agri-Recovery. That was when we first put it together. We built a program that year with the Canadian and British Columbia government that is still holds in place for Agri-Recovery. There's 17 different things that we have covered under there. And that same fellow, Jordan, said, had it not been for Agri-Recovery, I would not be here on this fifth generation ranch. So that's extremely, extremely important to what it is. That that ability and resilience to rebuild. And you mentioned earlier on livestock. That's a part of the, we got the pre, the post, or the during and the post. Livestock is part of the during, and we have to concentrate on them because we're saving those lives. And so that factors in so heavy in how we do it and making that progress throughout the situation.
And we will, of course, later in the show, we're going to talk a bit about sort of some of the ideas of what you think could be improved, and touch on some of those. Matt, just before we go to a break, I did want to ask, what has changed on your farm as far as, you can't change where it is unless you make some pretty big decisions and move. So what has changed in preparing for potentially the next flood?
At this point, we haven't made a lot of infrastructure changes, but my dad and I are having conversations about replacing our lowest barn, elevating that one yet again, basically. Because it seems like there's very little that's being done to prevent a flood of that magnitude from happening again. Most of that water originates in Washington State, and unfortunately, we can't dike their river for them. So our other option is to build the barns up. And also just have a plan in place. When we hear the siren, when we see the signs, equipment gets moved, young stock get moved, and then we have a plan for the milking herd.
Just quickly, how much warning did you have with the atmospheric river? How many days did you have to prepare?
Well, by Friday, it started raining really heavy. By Sunday night, we knew we had a problem. And by Monday night, everything was underwater. So yeah, it was fast.
Super fast. Okay. All right. We are going to take a quick break, and we'll bring in Tom Rosser, and we'll bring Dan back and talk about how we can work together between these three tranches as well. So we'll be back with more of RealAg Radio right after this.
Growing corn? With Envita, you can cut your nitrogen and maintain yield, or maintain nitrogen and increase yield. Envita takes nitrogen from the air and turns it into nitrogen for your corn. It provides a right place, right time source of nitrogen to maximize your yield. Farmers who use Envita see healthier plants, bigger cobs, and less tipback. Envita is guaranteed to add more bushels to every treated acre. Start growing with Envita. Visit azotic.com to learn more. That's azotic.com.
The Canola School on RealAgriculture.com is your one-stop shop for everything a canola grower needs. Check out our free video series on YouTube for all the latest in canola agronomy, research, marketing, and more. Don't have time to watch? Download the podcast version of the Canola School on RealAgriculture.com or anywhere you download your podcasts. Stay on top of all things canola with the Canola School on RealAgriculture.com, brought to you by BASF and Invigor Hybrid Canola.
And welcome back to RealAg Radio, again on location from the Canadian Federation of Agriculture annual meeting here in Ottawa, Ontario, brought to you by Cooperators Insurance. And welcoming back on the stage now Dan Watchorn of Cooperators. We still have Matt Dykshoorn, a dairy farmer from the Fraser Valley area of British Columbia. And joining us for the first time here on the show right now is Tom Rosser, Assistant Deputy Minister of Agriculture. Tom, you were actually on stage here yesterday filling in for some people who were in Washington, D.C.?
That's correct. I sort of think that, first prize for the attendance of the conference here is to hear from me once, and second prize is to hear from me twice. But glad to be here.
Is there another way we can get Tom up later? Tom, can you speak about the role of the federal government when it comes to this topic of disaster risk and relief, the process of that?
Yeah. In the earlier segment where I listened to Dan, just because we are through programs like we heard about agri-recovery, agri-insurance, disaster financial assistance, We're in the business of helping with the recovery process from extreme weather events. So the way we think about the problem is very, very similar to the way Dan talked about it. I mean, wildfires, floods, they've always been part of the reality on the Canadian landscape, but you look at any indicator in terms of expenditures, frequency and severity of events, just over time, they're getting more and more, severe, more frequent, more costly. And what do we do about them to build back more resilient, to reduce the vulnerability to extreme weather events? And of course, it was great to hear from Matt and Kelvin too, because no matter how much government spends or how much we try to help, if it doesn't work, if we can't be a good partner in the process of recovery from extreme events, then we're doing something wrong. And so with every event, we will do a hot wash to look back on what went right, what lessons we can draw from it. And we just need to adapt to the fact that there's a changing reality out there, and the way we think about these things and the way we address them has to evolve with it.
Dan, do you have thoughts on what Tom's talking about here?
Well, I think it's talking about partnership, right? Honestly, the starting part of the problem is understanding it, right? And we both agree that the frequency and severity of these events are on the rise. And if we continue to do what we do, we just need to pay more out in disaster relief. The mental health issue is real. You know, Matt, I recall the BC flood in December 2021. That was it was a devastating event. It was complicated because I think some of the landslides, the roads were washed out in many areas, so it was hard to even get to those farms. But if we are more prepared, if we do more things to prevent these things, or at least mitigate, to reduce the burden. And then I think the coordination between the private insurance sector and the government can help a lot too, because when we go out and we send our claims adjusters, we're often the first people on site to visit our clients. We inform them what they're not covered for, but leave them hanging. If we understood these programs, and if we actually help provide information, application forms on what they can do to actually make their claims, I think it would be a better experience. We'd lessen the mental health issues associated with these. All right.
Tom, there's several touch points here when it comes to a disaster and the federal government. There's agri-insurance, crop insurance, of course, or livestock price insurance in some cases. But you mentioned agri-recovery, agri-stability as a role, DFAA, disaster financial assistance. Agri-recovery, though, is probably the big one. And I know every time we have a disaster and we cover this or report on it, we have to refresh ourselves on the process of agri-recovery. Can you take us through how the program works behind the scenes in terms of an agri-recovery request being triggered and the steps that take place behind the scenes in terms of coming up with that funding, that support for producers going through the pain of a disaster?
Sure, I'll try to. I mean, agri-recovery is not a program. It's kind of more of a framework of how province will work with the federal government to help producers recover from an extreme weather event. So the process, when something has happened, a hurricane, a flood, a fire, a province can request agri-recovery, and that triggers a sort of a joint assessment between the province and the federal government to ensure essentially the event in question meets certain criteria. And once it does, the program kicks in, and its intention really is to cover the extraordinary costs associated with. So whether that's, I mean, in the case of a drought, perhaps it's or a flood for that matter, perhaps it's feed, perhaps it's cleanup and repair. And but the idea isn't to ensure damages per se, but rather to help producers deal with the extraordinary costs associated with a weather event.
So how do you decide whether you're covering transportation, whether you're covering fence posts, whether you're covering what's on that list of things that are covered?
There are guidelines within the agri-recovery framework that say that we'll cover this sort of thing, but not that sort of thing. Although with each incident, it will be a process of discussion, an iterative process between the province and the federal government, informed by discussions with producers about what the reality is on the ground. You'd mentioned as well DFAA. So with incidents like Hurricane Fiona in the Maritimes in 2022, or the atmospheric river events in BC in the fall of 2021, there is also this broader program that the federal government that has its own criteria, its own cost share ratios. It certainly can support agricultural producers, but it's broader than agricultural producers. It's for the kinds of disasters like hurricanes that don't just affect the agricultural sector, but have a broader sort of societal effect.
Mm-hmm. Matt, can you speak to your experience working with some of these programs and maybe some of the lessons learned, maybe if there were obstacles that you didn't expect or ways you could see it improved?
All in all, it went fairly well for us. We received a fair bit of help with reseeding the farm, replacing one of the farmhouses. There were some challenges with, initially I got a quote for repairing my house. After further thought, it's like there's no sense repairing a house that was flooded that heavily. We're going to knock it down. We're going to rebuild it higher. Somehow something got lost in communication, and I found out I was disqualified from the funding because I was going to replace it, not fix the old one. It took a fair bit of work, a fair bit of contact with one of the advisors. They were able to make an exception, but it caused a fair bit of stress that there was a whole bunch of money that I thought was going to go to replace that house, and they says, no, you have to fix the one you have. So things like that, I think, can be tweaked just to, when somebody wants to build back better, instead of just build back the way it was, I think they should be encouraged to do that.
So Dan, that's kind of what we talked about earlier in terms of how we build back with a lower risk situation than we had prior to the event happening. How do we determine who pays for that additional cost of building back better?
Well, I think this is where the industry needs to step in. I talked earlier about a program we've introduced in our coverage, Tomorrow Strong, that looks to partner with our clients on building back better. But we can't be the only insurer in Canada doing that. I think there needs to be a comprehensive look at how we as an industry can respond and to encourage this. And more so than that, I think that for those farmers who actually do exactly what you talked about, Matt, you should get a break on your insurance. You should actually see your insurance costs come down because you've now weatherproofed your farm, and if you have, you should be rewarded for that. So I think there's a lot of work we can do in the private insurance sector to support this.
Is this also just a communications problem in terms of working together between government and the farmers who are carrying some of the risk as well in terms of understanding these different scenarios?
I think it's a communication, but I think it's a historical thing. Yeah. Insurance has always been thought of as transferring the risk to an insurance company. And that has been the way we've operated. And we can't just be about indemnity. We can't just be about what we pay out. We need to be in the loss prevention business. So I think we need to balance loss prevention with indemnity. And if we do that, we look at doing exactly what Matt did, thinking longer term about what you need to do to deal with the weather events, because they're not going away, right? We have to learn to live with them. And so we need to educate, we need to partner, and we need to incent. And I think that's both on the private sector and the government.
That loss prevention, you're saying being proactive in terms of mitigating risk before it happens, and that's something that needs to be shared across all three different sectors that are represented here.
100%. Yeah, I think it's a collaborative partnership that brings resiliency, whatever the word you want to use. You want to use resiliency, you want to use climate adaptation, you want to use loss prevention, you want to use loss mitigation. They all mean the same thing, right? Dealing with these weather events and weatherproofing our farms, our homes, our commercial buildings to withstand them so that the impact of them drops. And if we reduce the impact of them, we can stabilize insurance premiums. And that's an important part of the equation.
Yeah, stabilizing those premiums as well as even just maintaining coverage. Matt talked about living in a floodplain, not being able to get insurance for water damage. What are we seeing in terms of, we hear stories from California and Florida, people unable to insure their homes. Are we seeing some of that happening in Canada, and is that something that we need to have on our radar as well when it comes to mitigating risk and being proactive about it?
Yeah, I mean, what we're seeing in the U.S., I mean, when I talked about the impact of the 4 events in 2024 at $8.5 billion, if you look at the hurricane in Florida or if you look at the wildfires in L.A., those are $100 billion plus events. Right? And that's just the insured losses. That doesn't include those individuals who were not insured or were only partially insured. So the impact is greater than those numbers. And insurers are pulling out of certain areas where the risk is becoming too severe. So there's going to be an affordability issue. There's going to be an availability issue. We need to prevent that from happening in Canada. There's a bit of it happening. It will increase if we don't do something about it proactively, and that would be harmful, because at the end of the day, communities, farmers can only be secure if there's availability of insurance.
Yeah, and if private industry pulls out, then we often turn to Tom's sector, the government, to backstop things. And Tom, what do you see in terms of the sustainability of government carrying these costs?
Obviously, I think the challenge from government's point of view is very similar to what Dan described. These costs are going up, and somebody has to bear the costs. I would pick up on a couple of points he made. One being the concept of building back better, and we did, in the response both to the atmospheric river and to Hurricane Fiona, try to explicitly build in provisions to allow people to not just build back what was there before, but to build back something that was more resilient. I think, too, to become smarter about not waiting for a disaster, but building in a resiliency, lessening vulnerability to an event. We have talked about, with our agri-insurance program, for example, can we incentivize through a premium structure where people take measures to reduce their vulnerability to drought or other extreme weather? Can we encourage that through premium structures? The other point that's kind of come out in the panel that I was really pleased to hear about, and that we're actively thinking about more and more, is mental health support as part of disaster response. I know different groups across the country have put in place supports. I know Farm Credit Canada is active in sponsoring some of them. And as we think about, as we prepare and try to prevent things like an African swine fever incursion, we're more proactively thinking about how mental health supports for affected producers can be part of that.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think it's time to take another break here. Thanks again to our panelists. We have Tom Rosser, Assistant Deputy Minister of Agriculture with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, Matt Dykshoorn, dairy farmer from southern BC, and Dan Watchorn of Cooperators. I think Tom, Kevin, and Dan will join Lyndsey for our final panel here, our final segment here on RealAg Radio. You're listening to RealAg Radio right here on Rural Radio, Channel 147 from the Canadian Federation of Agriculture.
Co-op knows your community because we live here too. Our teams are your trusted partners with a range of expertise to help support your entire farm operation. And we're giving back. In the past 5 years, Co-op has invested over $1.1 billion in the prairies through building, upgrading, and expanding local facilities. And we've returned over $1.17 billion to Co-op members in the prairies. Co-op, we're all building something for the future. Here for your farm, here for your family. Learn more at coop.crs/farm.
Before you get back in the field this year, spend some time with the Corn School on RealAgriculture.com. Get all the information you need on hybrid selection, planting depth, crop inputs, and more from a wide range of industry experts. A massive library of video content is available on demand when you need it most. Spend your time outside of the field, inside the classroom, with the Corn School on RealAgriculture.com.
Welcome back to RealAg Radio here on Rural Radio, Channel 147, Sirius XM. We are coming to you live from the CFA AGM here in Ottawa, Ontario. Joining me now, of course, Dan, Kevin, and Tom. We're going to try in this segment, I think, to really pull this all together, looking forward. Because, of course, this is an incredibly important topic. It's a very serious topic. And it's one that we can't just sit on. we have to be doing something actively to prepare for the next go-round. Kevin, I'll start with you with thoughts on, because you said something at the outset that, of course, a disaster typically happens to a person one time. So we don't get to necessarily leverage our own personal experience to prepare for the next, but we can learn from each other. How is that happening from your organization's perspective? Where do you want to see it go?
Yeah, thanks, Lyndsey. A really good question, and I'll try and make it a quick answer. It starts in the middle of the disaster. There's a lot of times, and especially back in 2017, we heard a lot of, we're learning for the next time. And we decided right away, we can't learn for the next time, we have to implement now because this is not like everything else in the past. One of the other things we learned, and of course my experience is more wildfire, but the other thing we learned was agriculture actually helped assist in firefighting. And we saw where we had cattle on the range where they were grazing the fine fuels, it slowed the fires, it stopped the fires, it gave them a chance. Where we had irrigation, we were able to do it. When we removed the fuel, so we were actually getting permitted in evacuation zones to bring guys in to hay the crops so we could remove that out of there. Besides that, we had the cattle moved out of there, but it's hard to imagine saving the cattle just to have them starve to death because we haven't got feed for the winter. So there was that. But we've been able to implement programs to assist during the fires, where we started with BC Wildfire Service Ranch Liaison Program, where we're part of the incident management team. We're right in there, and it's a coordination communication between the rancher and the incident team so that we're moving cattle ahead of the fire. We're actually working with the BC Ag Council right now. We're also working to coordinate at the Emergency Operations Centre so that they're all in line throughout the province. When I got evacuated, I had to go through 3 different regional districts for permitting to get back to my place. Unacceptable. So we're trying to streamline things like that. On another point, because we understood where livestock helped things, we're actually, and this is to one of the things for Dan and the insurers, we're actually using cattle right now to graze the fine fuels around cities and towns to be able to reduce those and actually create a buffer zone for that final stand, if it comes to that, to protect a city or important infrastructure by target grazing during critical time to remove those. I suggested to Dan earlier that, perhaps you can't give us a price and a break on the insurance, but maybe we can give it to those homeowners in that area that we're doing it to. And doing things for where we can show agriculture supporting the rest of society in other ways than just producing really good food is critical.
Mm-hmm. So, Dan, I'll go to you sort of on that point. And Kelvin sort of touched on that communication piece as well. I mean, we find necessity, of course, pushes for some of these things, but how do we coordinate some of these bigger, broader approaches to prevention?
Well, first of all, it is a matter of getting folks together and talking, because we have a collective interest, right? We have a collective interest in managing these events to reduce the impact, not just the financial impact, but the stress and the mental health impact. So we have a lot of information. We know where the hurricane zones are. We know where the hail zones are. We know where the wildfire zones are. We know where the flood zones are. And across Canada, there's higher risk of those events in different areas. So it's a matter of working with those communities. What is your high risk issues? What can be done both, at the individual farm level, but also within the communities? What infrastructure can we put in place? What are some creative solutions? One was just raised, right? About, minimizing the spread of wildfire through using a partnership with livestock and cattle farmers. So it's a matter of getting creative, but I think collectively, farmers, insurers, and government all want the same thing. So if it means we want the same thing, it's just a matter of us getting together and really putting forward some proactive solutions. And I think the time is right now.
I don't know that we're going to have much luck stopping the water coming from the U.S. Anyway, we'll leave that one for a moment. All right. Now, Tom, in thinking about government's role in so much of this, a lot of these programs, of course, take years to be developed. Then we change. We try to keep them evolving. Looking forward to the year ahead, we're certainly coming up to a new ag policy framework. What do the next few months look like on that front?
Well, I think we learn and evolve over time. We talked earlier about disaster financial assistance. They're updating some guidelines as of the 1st of April. Again, just drawing on the experiences of past. Listening to producers like Kelvin who have experience with the programs and what worked and what doesn't is really important, and trying to take that into account. But I think, and Dana touched on this, that we need to there's learning from incident by incident and trying to refine what you do, but we just need to realize that something fundamental and systematic is changing, and the ways that, whether it's private insurers or government, measures and quantifies risk just doesn't work as well as it when the tomorrow looks a little bit less like yesterday than we're used to, right? And we just all need to come to terms with what that means. I pick up on Dan's point too about data. You can never predict exactly where a fire or a flood is going to happen, but you can use data to identify areas, communities that are particularly vulnerable to certain types of incidents, and try to become more proactive that way.
In this process, and in reviewing some of these programs, we've heard today certainly the discussion of business risk management, and how that might need to evolve. From AAFC's perspective, what is useful information to take in on that front to potentially change things to make it better, to improve?
Well, when it comes to our business risk management programs, they're cost shared with provinces and territories on a 60-40 basis. Effectively, their management and changes in them are done more or less by consensus. So lots of dialogue, lots of feedback, getting things that work in different parts of the country, learning from one another. With programs like agri-recovery that are province specific, I think there's an opportunity for an experience in British Columbia to inform the broader conversation of how we might respond to other events in other parts of the country.
So, Kelvin, then, from your perspective, what would a successful collaboration look like?
Good question. I think that we're building towards that now. Like, a lot is coming from experience. We know, like, agri-recovery, for example, it takes over where insurance falls short, where it stops. And like agri-recovery won't cover something that's insurable, so that is where we need to make sure that we've got the everybody knowing where's what. I think that one of the other things, and this goes beyond the programs that we have that are for recovery, but it is what we do before, and it's preparation. And I will say that in British Columbia and the fires, we blame climate change, and I think that's wrong. It's actually what I would, this is where I'll get in trouble from my BC government, but I would say it's gross mismanagement of the landscape in how we've managed our forests and how we've managed that landscape, in that we've created the atmosphere on the ground for it. How we manage our parks, how we manage the landscape, and by doing things like silviculture, silvipasture properly. We had a mountain pine beetle event in BC where we've got deadfall everywhere. So it's, what do we do to reduce the fuels there? When it comes to floods and stuff, we have to build storage. We have to do things using beaver dam analogs, using storage to be able to trap and manage the water on the ground. There's things too that are results of those. We've seen major landslides and stuff. So those are more predictable. They'll come after the fire, after the flood. And so we have to be using that data that Dan is talking about to be able to start and do a better job of predicting what is coming. So let's not blame everything on the weather. With what we do to manage on the ground is extremely important to how we're going to get through these in the future.
It's an excellent point. When I'm overwhelmed, I try to think about what can I control. So I can't control the weather, but I can control how prepared I am. I can control my actions, what I do, those sorts of things. That's a good note, everybody, for all the U.S. stuff, too. Okay, so Dan, we'll wrap this up here. Hearing, some of these risk mitigation measures are very large scale. And there's obviously a role for data. There's a role here for everyone to participate. What does the technology piece maybe look like? How do we link this all together?
Well, I think it's first getting the stakeholders together, right? There's technology advancements that can support it, but it can't be done in a silo, and that's what we've been doing, right? The insurance industry has been kind of operating in a silo, government to some degree operating in a silo, and farmers have been trying to figure out what to do, but operating in a silo, and I think that we got to break that down. We have to really come together, and it's not really a technology solution, it's a collaborative solution, right? And we need to look and we have to brainstorm and be open to all different thoughts and concepts that we can do to manage this. But there is solutions, right? That's the frustrating part, right? We know that if we actually put our minds to actually prevention, that the need for the escalation of disaster relief will go down. It's not going to eliminate disaster relief, but the important part, if we can minimize the costs associated with these events and require fewer farmers having to use them, that's a win. It's a win for the farmers. It's a win for the government. And the weather-related issues are just real. We have to accept them. It starts with accepting that this is our new norm. And we have to really step into prevention if we're really going to combat it.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dan, and to the Cooperators, of course, for supporting today's show. Thank you, Kevin, Matt, and Tom, and of course my co-host Kelvin Heppner. That's all we've got for today's RealAg Radio. If you've got feedback on today's show, you can give us a call, 1-855-776-6147, or you can send me an email, lsmith@realagriculture.com. I'll be back tomorrow with Farmer Rapid Fire. Thanks, everybody, from here in Ottawa. We'll talk to you tomorrow.
Thank you for downloading this RealAg Radio podcast episode brought to you by Authority Strike Herbicide from FMC. Tackle tough weeds like kochia, cleavers, Russian thistle, and pigweed with the dual power of 2 Group 14 modes of action. Visit your local retailer today or visit ag.fmc.com/ca to find out more.